Hello, thanks for letting me speak with you today about open hardware, why it's important, and how you can use it in your own project development. Because I'm approaching this topic from a little bit different perspective than many of you, and because we haven't had a chance to meet face to face, it might be helpful for you to learn a little bit about my background. I'm a lawyer working for a tech company, and I spend most of my time doing software licensing, both related to proprietary software and also open source. Fortunately, at work, we've gotten rid of the suit and tie, and things are more casual these days, but this is still the formal me. In my spare time, though, I've been an amateur radio operator, or ham radio operator, for many years. These are a couple of pictures of me, slightly less formal, operating in radio contests from portable locations, which is something I really enjoy doing. As part of the ham radio hobby, I became very interested in measurement systems, and in particular, time and frequency measurement. I'm one of the time nuts that you might have heard of. The picture in the lower corner is the basement laboratory I had in our old house. Since this was taken, I've moved and I have much more space and I have much squared more stuff. There's some kind of power law at work there. And I run my own atomic clocks. The other picture is me adjusting one of the frequency standards, and I found it to be a truly fascinating passion, and it's something that ties me to your community because timing and time measurement is incredibly important for what you do. Also, through my amateur radio involvement, I became connected with an organization called TAPR. It's an international ham radio group that really thinks of itself as an R&D organization for amateur radio and related hobbies, and particularly the digital aspects of radio. The combination of time nuttery and TAPR led me to start developing products that TAPR could make available either as kits or as assembled products. Most of what I've done has been time and frequency related, but I've done a couple of ham radio projects as well. The picture in the lower right hand corner is a frequency divider based on a PIC chip that takes the input at 1, 5, 10 megahertz, for example, from a frequency standard and outputs a 1 pulse per second signal. I designed this board, and through TAPR we're making it available to the community. As a result of all this activity, I became interested in the idea of an open hardware license, and a number of years ago, some TAPR developers asked me to lead the effort to develop an open hardware license for a series of TAPR projects called the Open HP SDR, or High Performance Software Defined Radio Project, and that's why I'm here with you today. So why open hardware? Open hardware is shaped by the same goals that led to the development of open source software. It's community building. It's just fun to work with other people. It's sharing forward and backward. If you give to the community, you should be entitled to get back improvements that are made by those who've benefited and built on the work that you did. It's continuing improvement. It's always better to have more eyes involved, problems get solved, features and functionality get added, and the end result is a better product. And it's really a continuation of what makers, and I guess makers is the new word for amateurs, have been doing for over 100 years. Open hardware is not really a new idea. In fact, in the amateur radio community, it goes back to the turn of the last century. In the old days, almost all amateurs built their own equipment. There were magazines that published construction articles, and here's one to build a crystal radio set in a little metal pencil. Magazines published the schematics, and they published drawings to help people put the products together, and that was taken for granted. That's the way development happened for many decades. It's only recently that we've had the idea that open hardware is something new, and I don't really think that it is. What we're trying to do now is return to an old idea. The problem with that old idea is that printed circuit boards happened first, and it became difficult to create circuits at home that had the kind of density that you could get on a printed circuit card. But in the end, amateurs learned how to make their own PCBs. They used to use resist pens and other tools to then etch boards in their basement and drill the holes on a drill press. It was done. It was hard to do. complex boards, but amateurs found that there were ways to do that. But then we got surface mount technology, and amateurs said, how can we build with these tiny parts? Well, it turns out that we've learned how to do that as well. And now we're at the stage where we see products like this and we think, good Lord, how can we create something like this? It's far too complex. Look at the number of pins on that huge chip. Look at the number of tiny, tiny parts. That's beyond our capabilities to design or build ourselves. So, what's an amateur to do? How can hobbyists create new electronic designs when parts are microscopic and all the cool stuff is hidden inside chips with hundreds of pins? Are we doomed to become appliance operators who can only buy a finished product off the shelf and can't fix it or modify it or perhaps even understand how it works because it's just a black box? But as I was researching for this presentation, I discovered, or was reminded at least, that it's always been complicated to be on the leading edge. Back in the late 1950s, one of the amateur radio magazines published an article on building a high-performance ham band receiver. The original article was the HBR-8. It had 8 vacuum tubes, and HBR stood for ham band receiver. And that was a very popular article. Many people built that radio. They came up with improvements, and there were several articles that were published over the next few years for the HBR-11 and various other versions. And ultimately, by the early 1960s, we had things like this picture, which is one of the HBR-16 receivers, 16 vacuum tubes. This was designed and built by amateurs. All that sheet metal work, all the fabrication, all of the point-to-point assembly was done by amateurs, as well as the underlying electronic design. So it's always been complicated. And by the way, there wasn't just one of these built. There were scores, if not hundreds, of the HBR series receivers built, and there's still a thriving interest in them today. There's a website that focuses on them, and people lovingly restore them and still use them. So it's always been difficult. I think we're just seeing a new manifestation of that today with today's technology. So it's still possible for us to do these things. It's easier, in my view, to develop a state-of-the-art project today than it was 10 or 15 years ago. We have free and affordable design tools. We have schematic capture, circuit board layout, circuit simulation, sheet metal fabrication, all these tools that are either free or very low cost and available to hobbyists. We have online PCB manufacturers, and this still amazes me that I can use my free software, design a circuit board, email the files off, and a week later I have a package on my door that has the circuit boards that I designed and I can start building them. That's just astounding to me. And we also have toaster ovens. And what? Well, many people are using toaster ovens or hot plates or similar kitchen appliances to do high-density surface mount assembly. It's amazing what you can do with some ingenuity and very little money. So we have the capability to make those complicated boards today. So let's return to the question about why open hardware. Hardware developers have to wear many hats. There's the electronic design, there's the circuit board layout, there's something called design for manufacture. That's a big thing where I work, that you have to make sure that the parts that you specify are actually available, that they fit on the board, that all the mechanical things work properly. There's the actual assembly of the board. Some people have those skills, some people don't. There's testing to make sure that it works, and many other items. And you're much more likely to find these skills in a group of people rather than in one individual. And we believe that open hardware helps to build communities around projects to gather these skills and come up with something that the individuals would not be able to do by themselves, but as a community, they are well able to implement. And by the way, this last board that I showed you a few minutes ago, this is an open hardware project. This is a complete software-defined radio transceiver that was designed by the Open HP SDR group that I mentioned. Tapper helped sponsor an initial manufacturing run, and several hundred of these units assembled and tested were brought into the community, and now a commercial company is making them available. But here's the thing. We also make the blank circuit board available. We've sold a lot of those circuit boards, and we've seen evidence through email and information posted on the web that an awful lot of people have successfully built this product in their basement from scratch. So it can be done. So let's look at the open source software community and see how that helps create the kind of environment that we want to emulate for hardware. The GPL, or the Free Software Foundation General Public License, is probably the best known example of an open source license, and particularly one that's designed to create a community. It's the preeminent reciprocal or copyleft license. That means that those who take advantage of the work of others have to give back their improvements to the community. There are no restrictions on just using GPL software. You can modify it, compile it, use it as much as you'd like for yourself without having any obligation to anyone. But if you distribute it to others, you have to make the source code available. And if you modify it and distribute it, your modifications also have to be licensed under the GPL, and you must make the source code to your modifications available as well. This helps create that sharing reciprocal community. Users can benefit from each other's improvements under a model like this, and this is what we'd like to do with open hardware if we can. So why can't we just use the GPL? Well, the problem is that almost all software licenses, whether they're for proprietary software or open source software, and especially the GPL, perhaps more than any other license, are built around a legal concept of copyright, which is something that's established by the statutes of nearly every country, and it means what it says. The author of a work has the right to control the copies that are made of that work, and that right leads to the ability to license software and put terms on how it's used, modified, distributed, etc. There's a thing about copyright, though. It protects the expression of an idea. It doesn't protect the idea itself. Only patents can do that. So if I publish my radio design schematic, I can stop someone from making copies of the schematic, but I can't stop someone from building the design that the schematic describes. And that's a huge hurdle in trying to implement an open hardware license, because our whole goal is to build a community around the product, not just the idea of the product. We want to be able to require people who make the product in physical form to be part of this community. We could use a patent model, but patents are expensive and have some other problems. So what are the legal possibilities? If we think about the types of intellectual property that are available in most countries, we have the software license model with copyright, but as we just talked about, that doesn't work well for a product regime where we're making physical things. We have a patent license model, and that would work fine if only we had patents, but as amateurs, the cost and other issues around patents really make that an impractical approach. There's the possibility of using a trade secret or non-disclosure agreement model, so I won't, for example, let you see my design unless you agree that you're going to do what I want with it. But that's a little bit contrary to the whole point of openness, so it's really a non-starter. We could also come up with a model to use trademarks, and that's actually been done in a few cases, but it's of limited use and it's not really practical for a single product. It might be useful if you're trying to build an environment or an ecosystem around a set of compatible products. So that leads us to another option, which is to ignore all of these intellectual property rights as the foundation and just think about a traditional contract where the parties agree what they will and won't do. That's a model that I think is feasible for open hardware, and we'll talk more about implementing that in a moment. But when we start to develop an open hardware license, what are the things that it needs to do, leaving all that legal argument aside? Well, it has to address copying, modification, and distribution of the documentation that is sufficient to allow you to make the product. It also has to address manufacture and distribution of the product that are based on that documentation. Those are two different things, and an open source software license really can't address that second one at all. There's a third element too, that in an open hardware license, it may be important to include some other terms that aren't related at all to copyright. For example, if I'm contributing my design and someone goes off, builds the product based on my work, and it turns out that the version that they built is dangerous and hurts someone, is it fair for me to have a financial liability and get sued over an argument that my design was defective? That doesn't really seem right. So we would like an open hardware license to be able to address things like warranties and product liability that are somewhat less important, although not completely non-existent, in a software environment. What is the landscape of open hardware licenses? There have been several attempts at developing them. The early attempts, and by early I mean 2004, 2005, a couple of projects, Chumby for one and the Balloon Project for another, created licenses that they felt were open hardware designs. Neither of those ended up taking off for use beyond the projects that they were written for. They're still out there on the web, but I'm not aware of any current use for them. The Tapper OHL project started in 2006, and the OHL was released in 2007. CERN published their own version of an open hardware license a couple of years ago, and that's become very well known and has had a lot of activity. There's another license called the SolderPad hardware license that's relatively new. It's not very well known, but it could be very important because it fills a different niche than either the Tapper or CERN licenses. People often ask whether the Creative Commons license is a good one for use with open hardware, and I'll talk near the end of this presentation for a moment about whether Creative Commons is a good framework. Also, people want to know whether we can use an open hardware license for Verilog, VHDL, or other HDL code programmed into a chip type of creations, and I'll talk about that briefly as well. But let's talk about the Tapper OHL. It's the one that I know the most about, and I think it has some good illustrations of the issues that you face in trying to create an open hardware license. The OHL can be used for any hardware project. It doesn't have to be connected with Tapper. We've made it available for use by the wider community. It mirrors the GPL as much as possible in a hardware environment, and it tries to implement the copyleft idea that the GPL created. We only apply it to hardware designs, not to software, firmware, or VHDL Verilog. It's hard enough to get the open hardware part right without adding the complexity of trying to address HDL code as well. I think one of the really interesting things about the OHL is that not only is it a license for open projects, it was itself an open project. The development was started by a group of about 8 developers with several lawyers who were my colleagues and friends and real experts in various parts of this field contributing. But once we had a draft, we had a public comment period where the text was posted on a website that had a forum function, and we encouraged comments. I think we received about 80, and a number of those comments led to improvements in the final released product. So I think it's kind of cool that we used an open process to develop an open hardware license. Version 1 of the Tapper open hardware license was approved and released in 2007. We're currently working on version 1.1, which is really a set of minor changes based on what we've learned over the last 6 years. I'm going to spend a moment talking about the legal structure of the OHL because, again, in my mind, that is the hardest thing to get this right. We can't simply mirror a software license. Despite its name, the OHL actually operates as a contract, not simply a license, and there's a legal distinction between those two things. We don't rely on copyright. We don't reject copyright or any other IP right either, but the contract is the license is built on a different model, which is that of a binding contract rather than an IP license. Valid contracts require consideration. That's a fancy word for a bargain for exchange, the fact that in order for a contract to be meaningful, each party needs to give up something in order to get something. Under the OHL, we have two aspects that create that legal consideration. The first is the fairly straightforward idea that if I give you the right to use my documentation to my initial publication and availability to you, you need to agree to comply with the license terms in order to make use of what I provide you. I don't have any obligation otherwise to make it available. And secondly, and this is a very important aspect for creating community, each party grants the other a patent immunity. And I'll talk in a moment about a little bit more about what that means. But what's important for now is that these things create that consideration, that each party giving up something, each party getting something to create a valid license. I should note that the TAPR OHL is based on U.S. law. I'm a U.S. lawyer, and although I have some understanding of international legal structures, I'm not an expert. But we did try to make the OHL general enough that it can apply in most countries. How does the OHL work? It defines documentation, the description of the product, and the information that you need to be able to make it, and the products themselves, the stuff, to use a technical term. It allows you to distribute documentation. It allows you to modify documentation. However, if you modify the documentation and distribute the docs, then those modifications are subject to the OHL, which means you need to make the modifications available along with the distribution. It allows you to make and distribute products based on the documentation. If you just use the product yourself, you have no obligations whatsoever. You can do whatever you want with it. You don't have to share anything. But if you distribute the products, you must make the design files that you used to manufacture the products available to anyone who wants them. Again, just like the GPL concept of making the source code available that's required to make the executable code version of the program. If you use the documentation, you agree that you won't claim patent infringement against others who also use the documentation to make the product. Again, this is a really important part of the community. You've probably heard about all the patent litigation that goes on today. And under an open hardware model, we really don't want to allow one person who's benefited from the documentation to use their patents against others who've also benefited from that documentation. So this is a key aspect of the overall environment that we're trying to create. It's not correct to say that it's a patent-free environment, because there may also always be other people who have patents that they could assert against the product. But within the community, we're not going to go after each other. The CERN OHL was produced by CERN, kind of obvious. It was authored by Miriam Ayas, who's in the CERN legal group, and the project was coordinated and continues to be coordinated by our friend Javier Serrano, who I'm sure you all know. The CERN OHL is also based on the GPL model and has a copyleft requirement. It, like the TAPR OHL, applies to hardware only and doesn't cover software, firmware, or HDL or other code loaded into devices. The original version was somewhat CERN-centric, and by that I mean that it was written with the requirements of an academic, governmentally funded institution in mind, and that made it a little bit difficult to apply in more private contexts. However, there's been a lot of continuous work on the license, and the most recent version 1.2 that was released I think a month or so ago is licensor neutral and really usable now by anyone. As an aside, while I have a bias in favor of the TAPR OHL, since I'm very closely tied to it, the CERN OHL is doing the right thing, and it has virtually identical goals as the TAPR OHL. The two licenses are very much consistent with one another, and perhaps over time we'll be able to bring them closer together and possibly even merge them. They're both good efforts at trying to reach a good result, and the communities around the two licenses are very friendly with one another. The solder pad license is a newcomer. It was written by an English attorney named Andrew Katz, and it's based on the Apache open source license, version 2. The current version is 0.51, and the last public release I saw was about a year ago. I don't know if Andrew has done further work since then. Unlike either the Tapper or the CERN open hardware licenses, the solder pad license is not copyleft. It does not have a reciprocal component and doesn't require sharing. It addresses hardware products kind of in an interesting way. Like a software license, it talks about source code and object code, and it defines a hardware instantiation of the design as object code. That's a really clever approach, and we'll have to see how that works going forward. I think there's an important place for the solder pad license because not everyone and not every project is appropriately licensed under a reciprocal license, and having a non-reciprocal license available is really important. It'll be interesting to see how the solder pad license takes off, how it develops, but I think it fills an important role, and I commend Andrew for his work on it. By the way, the solder pad license also includes a patent license grant, which we've seen is a very important aspect of any of these licenses. Now, I'm often asked, why not just use the Creative Commons model for open hardware design documentation? After all, it's commonly used for other types of documentation. Well, it is great for letting people know how they're allowed to use your docs. And again, if you looked at the first slide of my presentation, I have the Creative Commons logo on it for non-commercial attributed use. It's excellent for that. But like any other copyright-oriented license, it doesn't address turning the design into a physical product, and I think that's the great breakdown that makes the Creative Commons approach not really feasible for a true open hardware design. I'm also asked very often, and in fact it came up just recently on the CERN OHL mailing list, what about FPGA, CPLD, and other devices that have loadable software or loadable code, because there's some argument about whether it's software or not. Do we need a separate license for those? Can we use the open hardware license model for those? Lots and lots of discussion and controversy about it, but I think most of the legal people that have been involved in the conversation have the view, and I have this view, that code running on a chip in almost all cases is covered by copyright because you have to copy the code to get it into the chip. And that's very much the way traditional software works, at least from a copyright perspective. But no courts have addressed the question, and there is an edge case around whether an ASIC that's manufactured with a certain code, as it were, and isn't field changeable, it would still qualify. I think there's no real answer for that. An ASIC might be questionable under a software license model, but then again, it might also be perfectly fine. There are some things that at this point we just don't know until a court someday resolves the question. Most of the open hardware licenses just don't try to go here. It's hard enough to address the pure hardware issues, and trying to address loadable code just increases the complexity. My recommendation is that for HDL programs, you should just use your favorite OSS license. Any of the open source licenses will work, and I have not seen anything that convinces me that a software model doesn't work for the typical code that's loaded into a programmable device. Well, that's the content that I wanted to share with you today. Here are some resources that you might find useful. The Tapper OHL homepage, the CERN OHL homepage. There's an open source hardware association that has a web page that has a broad range of information about open hardware in several different flavors. And you can always feel free to contact me. Here's my email, and if you're interested in my time nuttery and other strange activities, there's my website. I do have some backup materials that will be part of the presentation, but I'm not going to share them with you today, that talk more about how to use the Tapper OHL in practice. You may find those useful if you decide to use the Tapper OHL. Now, I believe that we're going to have a live question and answer session, and I look forward to the opportunity to chat with you live. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present today. Again, what you folks are doing fascinates me. I wish I could have been there in person, but unfortunately I had business travel that made it impossible for me to be in San Francisco. So thanks much for putting up with this pre-recorded presentation.